Somewhere in your backyard right now, there's probably a corner exactly the size of a parking space that you've never once thought of as farmland. Here's the claim that sounds wrong until you check it. That corner, worked correctly, can outproduce a quarter-acre of traditional row garden. This is not a rough guess. It is a documented method built by one retired engineer who got so annoyed at his community garden that he redesigned the entire idea of a backyard plot from scratch. 4 techniques, most of them nearly a century old or older, stack on top of each other in that same small square and quietly multiply what it produces. This breakdown explains exactly how, with the real research behind every number, and why almost nobody gardens this way anymore, even though nothing about it was ever actually lost. His name was Mel Bartholomew, and before he was famous for gardening, he spent his career as a civil engineer, the kind of person trained to look at a system and immediately notice where the waste is hiding. When he retired in the mid-1970s, he did what a lot of newly retired people do. He joined a community garden near his home. It should have been relaxing. Instead, it drove him a little crazy. Every plot on that lot was planted the same way his neighbors' parents had planted, and their parents before them. Long, straight rows, wide aisles between them, more than half the ground given over to paths you'd walk down rather than soil you'd actually grow anything in. He asked around, plot by plot, why everyone gardened this way. Nobody could give him a real answer beyond habit. It was what a farm looked like, scaled down to a backyard. And nobody had stopped to ask whether a farm's logic made any sense when the tractor that justified those wide rows was never coming anywhere near a residential lot. So Bartholomew did the thing an engineer does when a system doesn't add up. He went home and redesigned the problem from scratch, treating his own garden as the test case. Over roughly 2 years of trial and error, he landed on a plot exactly 12 feet by 12 feet, split into 9 raised beds of 4 feet by 4 feet each. And every one of those beds was subdivided again into 16 individual 1-foot squares, using nothing more than string or scrap wood laid across the top. 1 crop per square, spaced according to the plant's actual mature size, rather than the width of a tractor tire or a hand-pushed cultivator that was never going to touch that soil. He called it square-foot gardening. He published the book under that name in 1981, followed it up with an updated edition decades later, and hosted a companion series that aired on PBS and other educational networks. The book eventually sold close to 1 million copies, which is a strange kind of proof on its own. A method doesn't get bought by nearly 1 million households because it sounds nice in a magazine. It gets bought and rebought because the people who tried it in their own backyard told their neighbors it actually worked. The number that made it stick wasn't the yield alone. It was the ratio. Square-foot gardening is commonly credited with cutting the growing space needed for a comparable harvest by roughly 80% and reducing the water required to get there by something in the neighborhood of 90% when measured against the traditional row garden it was built to replace. Read that again, slowly, because it's easy to skim past. Not 80% more food from the same amount of space. Roughly 80% less space required for the same food. That's not a marginal efficiency tweak you'd expect from rearranging a garden bed. That's a fundamentally different category of growing. And the entire method traces back to one 12-12 corner, because one annoyed engineer refused to accept this is how it's always been done as an actual answer to a reasonable question. It's worth pausing on how unglamorous that origin actually is, because it's easy to assume a method this influential must have come from a university lab or a government agricultural program. It didn't. It came from one frustrated retiree with a tape measure, a notebook, and a willingness to spend 2 full years quietly testing a hunch in a plot most of his neighbors probably walked past without a second glance. That plot is your anchor for this whole discussion, both literally and as proof of concept. Everything from here forward assumes you're working with roughly that same footprint. A corner most suburban and even urban yards can find somewhere along a fence line or beside a driveway. What you're about to see is what happens when a modern grower doesn't stop at Bartholomew's spacing trick, as good as it already is on its own, and instead stacks three more forgotten, independently documented techniques directly on top of it inside the exact same 12-12 footprint. Here's the part that doesn't get said enough in most gardening content, and it matters for understanding why this exists at all. Intensive small space growing isn't a new invention that finally arrived to save modern gardeners. It's an old, thoroughly worked body of knowledge that most households simply stopped needing. And there's a real difference between a skill dying because it failed and a skill fading because the problem it solved temporarily went away. Go back further than Bartholomew, back to French market gardeners working small walled plots outside Paris in the late 1800s, feeding entire neighborhoods off land you could walk across in under a minute. That intensive method crossed the Atlantic in the late 1960s through an Englishman named Alan Chadwick, who taught it at a student garden project at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and folded in ideas borrowed from biodynamic farming on top of the French techniques he'd inherited. For most of human history, if your household had a small yard, that yard needed to produce something edible because groceries weren't a 15-minute drive away, stocked year-round from a continental supply chain that didn't care what season it actually was outside your door. Then came the second half of the 20th century, and two forces converged at almost exactly the same time. Land got cheap and plentiful enough after the post-war suburban housing boom that lawns, not gardens, became the default use for a backyard, a patch of grass you mowed and maintained rather than one you harvested from every week. And the supermarket supply chain got efficient enough fast enough that growing your own food stopped being a household necessity and quietly became an optional hobby. One many time-strapped families simply didn't prioritize once the alternative was a 15-minute grocery run. The skill of intensive growing didn't disappear because it stopped working. It faded from daily use because for most people in wealthier countries, the underlying need for it disappeared first. And skills that aren't needed tend to get passed down less carefully from one generation to the next. There's a generational piece to this worth naming directly, because it explains why so many people today feel like they're discovering something brand new when they first read about intensive growing, rather than rediscovering something their own grandparents likely practiced without ever giving it a formal name. A skill that isn't actively passed down for 2 or 3 generations doesn't just fade quietly into the background. It gets actively replaced in the popular imagination by whatever came after it. Ask most people today to picture gardening, and they'll picture straight rows and wide aisles, the exact layout Bartholomew spent 2 years dismantling, simply because that's the version of gardening that happened to be dominant during the decades when the skill was actively being taught or not taught to them. That's precisely the gap Bartholomew and the researchers who deepened his ideas after him quietly walked back into. Rising grocery prices, a renewed cultural interest in knowing exactly where food actually comes from, and a lot of people staring at an underused backyard and wondering whether it could do more than grow grass that needs mowing every week. All of that has pulled these techniques back into active use. Over the past couple of decades, the knowledge itself never actually left. It sat published, documented, and freely available the entire time. It was mostly the people using it day to day who did. Here's where the real payoff of the whole idea lives. It's worth being upfront about something before diving into the techniques themselves. None of these 4 ideas were developed together by the same person in the same decade, or even on the same coast. They come from an engineer in New York, a researcher in Northern California, university extension programs scattered across a dozen cold climate states, and indigenous agricultural traditions that predate all three by centuries. What makes this different from simply listing 4 gardening tips is that these 4 entirely independent bodies of research happen to interlock almost perfectly when applied to the same small plot. And that interlocking is what actually earns the comparison to a much larger garden. Bartholomew's spacing trick is the foundation everything else gets built on. But used entirely on its own, it gets you efficient, not extraordinary. What actually closes the gap with a quarter-acre of traditional garden is stacking 3 more independently researched layers on top of that same 12 footprint. Each one compounds the others rather than simply adding to them. And that compounding is the actual mechanism behind the results. Technique 1. Deep soil preparation. While Bartholomew was working out his spacing grid on the East Coast, a researcher on the opposite side of the country was attacking the soil side of the exact same underlying problem far more aggressively. His name is John Jeavons, and since the early 1970s, he has run a research and teaching organization called Ecology Action out of Willits, California, a small town in Mendocino County, a few hours north of San Francisco. Jeavons didn't stop at rearranging where plants sit on the surface of a bed. He went straight after the dirt itself, developing what he calls the grow bio-intensive method, built around double-digging garden beds down roughly 2 feet, well past the depth most home gardeners ever disturb, specifically to give plant roots room that a conventional garden simply never offers them. The published research behind this claim is specific enough to be independently checked rather than taken on faith. And it's worth sitting with the actual figures instead of a vague, "it works better" claim you'd find on a seed packet. Ecology Action's own published numbers put bio-intensive yields at somewhere between 2 and 6 times what conventional row method gardening produces on an equivalent patch of ground, while simultaneously using somewhere between 50 and 75% less land, and, in some documented cases, up to roughly 88% less water to get there. In one interview, Jeavons stated that in as little as 100 square feet of properly prepared bio-intensive bed, a grower can realistically raise several $100s worth of vegetables and soft fruit across a single growing season. 100 square feet, that's a plot smaller than a typical one-car garage and smaller still than the 12 footprint we are discussing. The mechanism behind those numbers is almost boring once you actually understand it, which tends to be a reliable sign that something is genuinely real rather than a marketing trick dressed up as science. Loosen soil deep enough and plant roots stop competing sideways with each other for the same shallow, compacted band of nutrients and moisture that a conventional garden traps them in. They go down instead of sprawling out. That single shift lets you plant noticeably closer together on the surface than a conventional row garden ever safely could, because the real competition for resources is happening in a vertical dimension that most backyard gardeners never think to touch, let alone prepare properly before the first seed goes in. Technique 2. Building vertically. Once your soil beneath the surface is doing more work per square foot than a conventional bed ever could, the next forgotten move is to stop thinking of your garden as a flat plane at all. Vertical gardening, meaning training, vining, and climbing crops up trellises, cattle panels, and simple A-frame structures, instead of letting them sprawl across open ground, has been formally studied by university agricultural extension programs, and the resulting numbers are not subtle in the slightest. Research summarized from University of California, cooperative extension work on small-space food production found that vertical growing methods can increase yield per square foot by 3 to 5 times compared to conventional row planting occupying the exact same amount of ground. Think through what that actually means once it's sitting inside your 12 corner. A single 6-foot A-frame trellis occupies roughly 4 feet of ground space at its base. But once you count both sloped sides of the frame, it offers close to 50 square feet of usable growing surface. You've essentially borrowed most of a second garden's worth of growing area and hung it in the air directly above the first one without needing a single extra inch of actual yard to make room for it. Pole beans, cucumbers, indeterminate tomato varieties, and even smaller melon types supported in a fabric sling all take to vertical training well. And most of them are the same crops home gardeners already grow, just redirected upward instead of left to sprawl. There's also a second, quieter benefit here that doesn't show up cleanly in the yield percentages, but matters just as much to a home grower over a full season. Lifting foliage off bare soil dramatically cuts down on the soil-borne fungal disease that ruins so many backyard harvests every summer, simply because air can finally circulate freely around the leaves instead of getting trapped against damp ground the way it does in a sprawling ground-level planting. Technique 3. Companion planting the old way. This next technique predates both of the researchers already covered by thousands of years, and it comes directly from indigenous agricultural knowledge developed long before European contact reached North America. Growing corn, beans, and squash together in the same mound, rather than in separate, isolated rows, is a method most closely associated with the Haudenosaunee, also known as the Iroquois Confederacy, in what is now the northeastern United States, though closely related versions were independently developed and adapted by numerous other indigenous nations across the continent, each one fitting the core idea to their own local climate and soil. The underlying mechanics are elegant enough that modern agricultural science, arriving centuries later, essentially confirmed, rather than improved on what was already known. The corn grows a tall, sturdy stalk that functions as a living trellis for the climbing beans planted right beside it, quietly doing part of the structural job that Technique 2 just paid you to build out of lumber and welded wire. The beans, in turn, host nitrogen-fixing bacteria colonized in their root nodules, pulling nitrogen straight out of the surrounding air and depositing it into the soil, feeding the heavy-feeding corn planted right next to them at essentially no cost. And the squash spreads low and wide across the open ground between the two, its broad leaves shading out competing weeds and slowing moisture evaporation from the exposed soil surface, doing the same job a bag of purchased mulch would otherwise be handling for you. 3 plants, 3 distinct functional jobs, and each one is quietly covering a cost the other 2 would otherwise have to absorb on their own. This isn't a folk story dressed up loosely as horticulture. It is documented functional companion planting that indigenous agricultural communities relied on for genuine food security long before the phrase companion planting existed anywhere as a modern gardening term. And it drops directly into a 12x12 intensive bed, alongside everything else being stacked here without requiring any additional ground space of its own. Technique 4. Stealing weeks from winter. The last layer in this stack isn't about space at all. It's about time. And it's the one technique people most consistently skip, mostly because it sounds like more effort than it actually turns out to be in practice. A cold frame, at its simplest, is nothing more than a bottomless box with a clear hinged lid built low to the ground that traps solar heat during daylight hours and holds onto a portion of it through the following night. University extension programs across multiple cold climate states have measured this consistently over decades of published guidance. A basic cold frame typically extends the usable growing season somewhere in the range of 2 to 6 weeks on each end of the calendar, both spring and fall, and can keep its interior running anywhere from 5 to 15 degrees warmer than the ambient outside air on a clear day. You can build one out of a salvaged old window sash and scrap lumber in a single afternoon for well under $50 in materials, and in many cases for close to nothing if you're working entirely from reclaimed material. What that modest investment actually buys you isn't just a handful of extra lettuce harvests tacked on to either end of the year. It's more full growing cycles stacked into the exact same 12 footprint over the course of a single calendar year. A bed that would otherwise sit bare and unproductive from the first hard frost straight through to the last one is instead quietly producing cool season greens through weeks that most conventional gardens have already surrendered entirely to winter. This is the technique that ultimately turns the other three from a strong single-season yield into a genuinely compounding one over time. Because every additional planting cycle squeezed into a single calendar year is functionally free square footage you never had to physically locate anywhere else in the yard. Putting the stack together. None of these four techniques is rare information sitting locked away somewhere behind a paywall. Bartholomew's spacing grid is documented in a book that has sold close to 1 million copies over more than 4 decades. Jevons has published his research openly and continuously for 50 years through a nonprofit built specifically for that purpose. Cold frame plans are sitting freely on university extension websites right now, available to anyone with an internet connection. Companion planting has been demonstrated and taught by indigenous communities for centuries and is now standard respected material in agricultural extension programs across the country. What's actually rare isn't access to the knowledge itself. It's the willingness to stack all four techniques together in one small, deliberately prepared plot, instead of picking a single one and calling the project finished. A grower who deep preps their soil, builds vertical structure into that same bed, companion plants the right crops together within it, and then extends the growing calendar around it with a $40 cold frame isn't running 4 separate hobbies in parallel. They're compounding 4 independently documented multipliers on the exact same 12 corner. And that compounding effect is the honest engine sitting behind the quarter-acre comparison. It's worth being precise about what that comparison actually means, rather than letting it float as an unexamined claim. It's a framing that researchers and experienced intensive growers use to illustrate what stacked techniques can realistically achieve against a sparsely planted, single-layer traditional plot, planted the old row and aisle way. It is not a guaranteed formula where each multiplier simply stacks on top of the last in clean arithmetic, and your actual results in your actual yard will depend heavily on your soil, your sun exposure, your climate, and how consistently you show up to tend it week after week. But the direction of the comparison, a small, intensively stacked plot, meaningfully closing the gap with a much larger, conventionally spaced one, is exactly what the underlying research from Ecology Action and multiple university extension programs keeps independently pointing toward from entirely separate researchers working decades apart from one another. The footprint. None of this requires acreage, and that's the entire point of focusing on a 12 feet wide 12 corner instead of anything resembling a farm. A dozen raised bed boards, some hardware cloth if rabbits or groundhogs are a problem where you live, a couple of simple trellis panels, and one cold frame built from a salvaged window is genuinely the entire physical footprint this method asks for. You could fit this along a fence line, in a narrow strip beside a driveway, tucked against a garage wall that gets good afternoon sun, or across the sunniest quarter of an ordinary suburban backyard without needing to touch the rest of your lawn at all. No tractor, no tiller in most cases, and no permit, since a raised bed and a small cold frame fall well outside anything a typical residential zoning code regulates. Just one corner that gets decent, consistent sun and a genuine willingness to prepare that soil properly one time before any of the four techniques start paying you back on it. Materials realistically run somewhere between $100 and $300 for a first build, and that's on the high end before any reused or salvaged lumber gets factored in. Raised bed frames, a handful of trellis panels, or a roll of cattle fencing cut to size, an old storm window for the cold frame lid, and enough quality compost to fill 9 deeply prepared beds. None of it needs to be purchased new. And most experienced growers using this exact stack report building their first plot almost entirely from material they already owned or picked up secondhand. The honest catch, every method covered here comes with a real cost attached to it. And that cost isn't money. It's labor and patience concentrated into a small space, instead of spread thin across a large one. And that's a fundamentally different rhythm than most casual gardeners are used to. Double digging a bed 2 feet down by hand, the way Javon's published research calls for, is genuinely hard physical work the first time you attempt it. It is not a quick weekend chore squeezed in before lunch. It's closer to a standalone project. And skipping that step entirely, or doing it only halfway to save time, is the single most common reason a bio-intensive bed underperforms its own published research numbers by a wide margin. The soil preparation is where the bulk of the yield actually originates. Shortcut it and everything built on top of it. The trellises, the companion planting, the cold frame, is standing on a noticeably weaker foundation than the research assumes. There's also a real learning curve on the companion planting that catches a lot of first-time growers off guard. Corn, beans, and squash, grown together, need to go into the ground in roughly the correct order and timing. Corn planted first, to get a genuine head start on height, before the beans are introduced, and need something sturdy to climb. Or the beans will quickly overwhelm young corn stalks that haven't established themselves yet. Get that sequencing wrong in your first season, which is common, and you end up with a tangled mess rather than the clean cooperative system described earlier. That's a completely fixable mistake once you understand it. But it is a mistake nearly every first-time grower makes at least once before they get the timing right. And the cold frame, for all its low material cost, genuinely needs daily attention on sunny days, not occasional check-ins. Left closed under direct, strong sunlight, the sealed interior can overheat and cook whatever's growing inside faster than an actual hard frost would ever have killed it outright. It needs to be vented open in the morning as temperatures rise and closed again before evening as they drop, which means it functions as a small daily commitment for the entire stretch of the season. It's in use, not a set it and forget it box you check on once a week. There's a timeline honesty worth adding here, too. None of these 4 techniques hand you the full published numbers in their very first season. Deep-dug soil needs a season or 2 of added organic matter to really hit its stride. A first-year trellis planting is still teaching you which crops in your specific climate actually want to climb versus which ones sulk when pushed vertically. The companion planting almost always needs 1 full season of trial and error before the spacing and timing click. Realistically, you're looking at year 2 or 3 before this stacked plot is performing anywhere near the ceiling the research describes. And any version of this that implied otherwise would be doing you a disservice. Climate is the last honest variable worth naming, and it's the one that depends entirely on where you're actually gardening. The cold frame figures cited here come from extension programs in genuinely cold winter states, and a 2 to 6 week season extension in a harsh northern climate is going to look different than the same technique applied somewhere with a much milder winter to begin with. The vertical gardening multiplier assumes decent sun exposure across a full growing season, which a shaded urban lot might not offer without some pruning of whatever's blocking that light. None of these techniques fail outright in a difficult climate, but the exact numbers are drawn from the specific conditions each study or organization was working under, and your own results are the only figures that ultimately matter for your own yard. None of this is a reason to skip the method altogether. It's a reason to go into it knowing exactly what kind of trade you're making. This is a labor trade, not a money trade. You're not buying your way to a bigger harvest with better tools or a bigger budget. You are spending deliberate, genuinely concentrated effort on a small footprint instead of spreading thin, occasional effort across a much larger one. And that is a meaningfully different rhythm than most people expect walking into their first season of gardening. Who this is for, and the payoff. This isn't really about becoming a market farmer overnight. Though the honest surplus from a well-run 12x12 plot absolutely can end up on a farmer's market table, a small neighborhood produce stand, or an informal box shared with a handful of neighbors if that's a direction you eventually want to take it. The more immediate, far more universal payoff is simpler than any of that. It's what this one corner does to an ordinary household grocery bill over the course of a full year. Run the figures. Jevons has documented several $100s of produce from as little as 100 square feet in a single season. Against a 12x12 plot that's nearly double that footprint on its own and stacked with 3 additional documented multipliers layered on top of his baseline soil method, and you're looking at a meaningful, genuinely measurable offset against what an average household spends on produce at the grocery store, especially once the cold frame stretches. That same harvest window into months most conventional backyard gardens have already gone fully dormant for. This works particularly well for a specific kind of household. It suits someone who already has a small, underused, sunny corner rather than acres to spare. It suits someone who has more spare time on evenings and weekends than spare money for a grocery budget, since the entire trade here is effort for output rather than cash for output. And it suits someone who's willing to treat the first season as a genuine learning year rather than expecting the full published numbers on their very first attempt. Because, as the honest catch section already laid out, this stack takes a season or two to really hit its stride. But the real insight worth carrying away, the one worth sitting with longer than the raw numbers, is what these 4 techniques actually do once you stop thinking of them as 4 separate tricks and start treating them as one connected, self-reinforcing system. The same fundamental reframe that made Bartholomew's original 12x12 plot so much more valuable than a neat spacing idea on its own. Deep soil feeds vigorous vertical growth. Vertical growth frees up ground space underneath it for companion planting. Companion planting quietly builds soil fertility for free. The exact fertility next season's deep bed preparation depends on to work as well as it did the first time. And the cold frame simply buys you more full turns of that entire cycle inside a single calendar year than the plot would otherwise get. Each technique is doing part of another technique's job without being asked to. The very same compounding logic that made the original Three Sisters mound function centuries before anyone ever formally called it a system. There's also a less quantifiable payoff sitting underneath the grocery bill math that's worth naming, because it's the part growers who've run this stack for a few years tend to mention unprompted. A 12 feet and 12 plot running all 4 techniques together isn't just producing more food than it looks like it should. It's producing on a schedule you control directly, rather than one dictated entirely by a supply chain you have no visibility into. When a cold frame is holding cool season greens through weeks, the rest of the neighborhood's gardens have already gone dormant. That's not just a yield number on a spreadsheet. It's a small, tangible piece of predictability sitting in a corner of your own yard, independent of what's happening at the grocery store that particular week. That's the actual argument sitting behind this discussion once you strip away the punchy framing. It isn't that four clever tricks magically multiply a tiny plot's output into a literal quarter-acre on paper. It's that four well-documented, independently researched techniques, deliberately stacked together instead of used one at a time in isolation, close a gap that looks flatly impossible right up until you understand that a conventional quarter-acre planted the old row and aisle way most backyard gardens still default to is mostly empty walking space and half-used growing season. A 12x12 corner that wastes almost nothing and sits idle for almost none of the calendar year is quietly playing an entirely different game on a fraction of the ground. You don't need a farm anywhere in your life to test any part of this. You need one sunny corner you almost certainly already have sitting unused somewhere on your property, and a genuine willingness to prepare it properly instead of quickly. Start with just the soil preparation and the spacing. Bartholomew's original idea entirely on its own before you add a trellis or a cold frame on top of it. Get one full season of that right. Watch closely what a properly prepared 12x12 bed actually produces compared to what you honestly expected going in, and then layer in the next technique only once the first one has proven itself out to you in your own yard, in your own soil, under your own specific patch of sun. The barrier here was never land, and it never really was. A retired civil engineer in a New York community garden proved that with 9 444 boxes and a bag of vermiculite roughly 50 years ago, and researchers working quietly out of Willits, California, have spent the decades since methodically proving how much further that same core idea can be pushed when the soil underneath it gets taken seriously. What's actually rare in all of this isn't the growing space sitting in your yard right now. It's finding someone willing to prepare a small corner properly, rather than a large corner carelessly, and then actually follow through on it season after season. So, tell me honestly, looking out at your own yard right now, is there a 12x12 corner sitting there, doing nothing more than growing grass you have to mow every week anyway? Drop it in the comments below, sun exposure and all, and I'll tell you exactly which of these four techniques to start with first. If this story changed the way you look at the unused patches of your yard, please subscribe and like the channel. We are unearthing the history and methods that have been overlooked for too long. Let's cultivate a more productive future together. The next treasure of knowledge will be revealed soon.